بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم كل وليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا. اللهم اجعلنا من أنصاره وأعوانه. اللهم صل على محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Yes, we have 13 people online. So this session and these sessions is in they are in continuation of the two series that we had in the past about overview on Mikyar al-Makarim, discussions about Imam Mahdi alayhi salam, and inshallah these four sessions will be focusing on the concept of Mahdawiya and Imam Mahdi alayhi salam in the Quran. I will have a very brief introduction why we are doing this, and then inshallah we'll benefit from Sayyid Suleiman, and then we'll continue this session. Everyone can see slides, friends online? Okay. So why it is important that we talk about the concept of Mahdawiya and Imam Mahdi in the Quran. Some of us may wonder that this is something that was mentioned in the Sunnah by Prophet, by the Imams alayhi salam, and there is no need, and we don't expect Quran to talk about it. And we have the Hadith Thaqalain and those concepts that we don't need to go to Quran and rely on Quran on these. But this is not the approach that Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam they took when they were educating the Shia. So for that, I wanted to mention two hadith, one from Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the other one from Imam Jawad alayhi salam, that why it is so important that we know our religion, and especially the Shia beliefs, the core Shia beliefs from Quran, and know the roots and how Quran as the fiqh akbar, the greater weighty thing that Prophet alayhi salam left with us and encouraged us to behold to, is the source of should be the source of our belief. So Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa says, إذا التبست عليكم الفتن كقطع الليل المظلم فعليكم بالقرآن. So in times of trials, when things get complicated, when you are facing credal challenges, I don't want to narrow it down only to credal challenges in any trial. When darkness surrounds you, do what? Hold firmly to the Quran, meaning you will find a solution and that will help you pass that challenge. And very interesting hadith. Sorry, I said from Imam Jawad. It was narrated from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam that Imam says, whoever doesn't learn and doesn't understand our teachings, من لم يعرف أمرنا من القرآن لم يتنكب الفتن. Whoever doesn't understand and learn, and in another word, know the roots of our beliefs, meaning that Amrana means like the core Shia beliefs from Quran, they will not avoid or survive trials or challenges. So that this encourages us to know the roots and the foundations of our belief from Quran in order to be firm and be safe from the misconceptions, challenges that we ourselves face, or our friends and community members. Sometimes they have questions. It's important that first we can bring the reasoning from Quran. So that's why we are having this short course, inshallah, in 4 sessions. And with that, we asked Sayyid Suleiman, and he has honored us. Alhamdulillah. Thank you, Sayyid. We start with the overview of Quranic patterns and how Quran explains things and elaborate on things, and what are the patterns of Quran. And with after that, inshallah, we will dive into verses from Quran and discuss more. Thank you so much, Sayyid. Jazakumullah khairan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And thank you for the opportunity to join you. These sessions are very blessed and very important for all of us to learn and also to review, and most importantly, to affirm our commitment to Ahlul Bayt and to Imam Mahdi alayhi salam in particular. Allah hasten his reappearance. Briefly, I want to just discuss a prerequisite for us to understand the verses that speak about Imam Mahdi and the topic of Mahdawiya in the Quran. And this is because there is a common question that comes from people that why are these doctrines that Shi'i Muslims believe in not more explicit in the Quran? Sometimes it requires a little bit of context, it requires a little bit of explanation, or it requires contemplation in order to understand what the Quran is referring to. Just to give an example, when the Quran says, "Ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum," obey Allah and obey His Prophet and those given command over you. Well, if you contemplate that verse, and if you look at the context of the Quran and the ahadith of the Prophet explaining, then it's clear that this implies that those given authority are worthy of absolute obedience, that they are ma'asum, and that it can only be referring to Imam Ali and the Imams, the same people referred to in إِنَّمَا وَلِيُّكُمُ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, Ayatul Wilayah. And that verse itself is also something that is in need of contemplation and context and explanation by the Prophet. So people ask this question, well, this is not an explicit verse. Why doesn't Allah say, "Ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul wa Ali ibn Abi Talib"? Why doesn't the Quran say, "Al-A'imma Ithna Ashar"? Why doesn't the Quran say the Imams are ma'asum? So this is a common question. And to answer that, first step is to understand the nature of the Quran and its revelation. Imagine that you are writing a book, a textbook, for example, on any subject. And that book has to address both illiterate people and highly educated people. It has to address people who believe that the earth is the center of the universe and the sun and the moon and the stars revolve around the earth. But it also has to address people who know the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, and they spend their spare time reading about string theory and other topics that I don't understand. So it would be impossible for us to have a book, even if I am an expert. Let's say I'm a physicist. Let's say that I am an astronomer. But for me to be able to convey that in a way that the person with a very different worldview will be able to benefit from, and a person with a different worldview will also be able to benefit from, that would be impossible. Because at some point in my explanation, if I believe that the earth is not the center of the universe, I'm going to say something that will contradict it. That person with that understanding is going to say, oh, this is just all mythology and fake. And if I go with that person's primitive understanding, then the sophisticated person with greater knowledge will say, oh, this is a primitive explanation. This is a mythological explanation. It's not real. So the Quran, it does talk about creation and cosmology, but primarily within guidance. The Quran is addressing people who until yesterday were so primitive that they would literally bow down before rocks and idols that they carved with their own hands, and even uncarved stones that looked a little special with some crystals. That's an idol. This is from God. It can give me benefit or harm. And the Quran was also addressing people from the Roman and Persian and Abyssinian civilization and Arabic-speaking Christians and Jews and people with great intelligence and great sophistication within their own religions and within their own cultures. The question is, how do you square that circle? You square that circle by using multiple layers of meaning. This is the key point that we have to understand before we approach the Quran on any topic of theology or of law. When you have to address a diverse audience, then one way is you use lowest common denominator, meaning you just give the answers that everybody agrees upon. That's not effective because it doesn't really give any benefit to those highly intelligent and highly sophisticated people who are looking for specific guidance. Lowest common denominator is the lowest. The effective way is to have multiple layers of meaning so that some meanings are very obvious. That's what the Quran calls muhkam. And some things are intended by design to require contemplation. It's not a test in the sense that God is not trying to throw you off, but God is ensuring that your process of learning that material makes you worthy of that material. So it is a kind of test. Sorry? It's a kind of, one kind of test is pass or fail. It's just, you failed, all right, goodbye. Another kind of test, let me give you the best example in modern life. They say that the best example of whether a person can be an effective president is how they run their campaign. Because usually, this was an exception, but normally presidential campaign is about 2 years. From when you have a primary, you have to compete against people in your own party who have very similar positions. You have to fight against them, but not destroy them too much, or you'll lose your own party. Then you have to go to 50 states and run a campaign and fundraise and policy and answer questions about your past and your future vision. It's a very complicated thing. What do they say? That's a test. If you can run a campaign, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise that you have to put together very fast, that shows that you have the competence to maybe be a good president. But if your campaign fizzles out, that shows that you might not. So this is the kind of test I'm talking about. The process of learning the material in the Quran makes you worthy of the material. And if you don't understand what إِنَّمَا وَلِيُّكُمُ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا means, if you don't understand what أَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ وَأُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنكُم means, then probably if Allah had made it obvious, it would be like if somebody just gave me the presidency. I'd mess it up in the first day, right? Because I've never run a multi-billion-dollar enterprise in 50 different states. What does this mean about Mahdaviyat? Then I know I'll finish on time.
No. Don't finish on time.
So this is the paradox. Bear in mind what I just said. Keep the presidential example in mind. Having to work for 2 years to build a campaign and win an election versus just being handed the presidency, even if you're very smart. It's two very different things. This is the paradox of the Quran. When it comes to Imam Mahdi, all of the prophets, from the very first prophet and their successors, Awsiya, every one of them gave the good tidings of the coming of Imam Mahdi. This was part of the teaching of Ibrahim alayhi salam, of Musa alayhi salam, of Isa alayhi salam, of Dawood alayhi salam, before that of Nuh alayhi salam, of Adam alayhi salam. The promise was always there with humanity. It is in the Quran, in the revelation of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, that this divine promise is going to take place in our time. And yet, the Quran does not have that kind of explicit message about Imam Mahdi that you would expect. Normally you would say, all right, in the time of Prophet Adam, in the time of Prophet Nuh, in the time of Prophet Dawood, there were many more prophets that were going to come. There were many more successors of the prophets. There were other books of revelation. Allah just needs to give a hint. This is going to happen. But then in the time of the last prophet, you should have, the greatest detail. So if there's a book of Revelation in the Bible, Muslims might expect the Quran will have several chapters, signs of the Day of Judgment, signs of the Mahdi, the history of, what's going to take place after the Dhuhur. You'd expect it to be more explicit. But the Quran, it does not do that. As you will see, it talks about the promise of the Mahdi in many different ways. And it quotes previous scripture that there is a certain sophistication and a certain symbolism that exists within the Quran. Do you see how that's opposite of what you'd expect? Normally you'd say, as you get closer, give more detail, be more explicit. And what we find, of course, the previous scriptures, we don't have access to the full scripture. But if we just take at face value, we find in some ways the Quran is becoming less explicit. And even when it talks, وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي الزَّبُورِ, it refers to Zabur, but it doesn't give greater detail, at least in that passage, than the Zabur gives. Why? Think back to the kind of test that I said. A test to give you the message only if you are worthy, or to give you the test to the extent that you are worthy. Get the presidency or any elected office to the extent that you can run an effective campaign, you can show that you can manage it, you can run it, and not otherwise. As you get closer, it's more risky, isn't it? As you get closer, the power and the potential for people to claim to be a false Mahdi gets much more. The danger, because the promise is coming closer. So the Quran, it offers that message in a very miraculous manner. That the message gets through, but it wants to prevent Muslims from being easily able to abuse and misuse that message. So all Muslims believe in Imam Mahdi, with exceptions that we don't even need to mention. Among the people who talk the most about Imam Mahdi, who believe the most strongly in Imam Mahdi, we believe that he is alive, that he is ready and waiting for God's commandment to reappear. Every day we are encouraged to reaffirm our allegiance to him, to pray for his reappearance. The greatest ibadah is intidharul faraj. So this is such a strong, such a powerful, passionate, fervent part of our religious life. And yet, you find that there are no false claimants to being Imam Mahdi. Or if those false claimants come, then our ulama, our institutions, and our mu'mineen are able to refute it and marginalize it very effectively and very quickly. So among the Muslim schools of thought, the danger of false claimants and the abuse of the belief in the Mahdi has been the least among those who believe the most in Imam Mahdi. That's not normally how things happen. Normally what happens when people believe in something very strongly, it's very easy for some to say, all right, you've been praying, you've been crying, you've been waiting, oppression is so great, I'm the Mahdi. And then you mislead a large number of people. So this is now how you should understand the verses of the Quran. Why did I give this explanation? Because people will often say that, all right, you Shia believe that there are 12 Imams. Where is the name of Imam Ali in the Quran? It's not there. I don't believe in this. You believe the Imams are ma'asum? Give me an explicit verse that talks about Isma, not an explanation that Ayatul Tathir requires Isma. Just give me an explicit verse. It's not there. I don't believe it. You believe that the 12th Imam has a long life and he is Imam Mahdi, and where does the Quran say that explicitly? All of these beliefs, as you will see, are found in the Quran, but not on the surface and not explicitly. But that's not a weakness. That is actually the miracle of the Quran, and that is the strength. Because the Quran doesn't want to just spoon feed you an answer that would then be open to abuse. It would be understood by some and misunderstood by others. The Quran wants to give you the answer if you're looking for guidance, but give you the answer by training your intellect so that by the process of getting to the answer, you are worthy of the answer. And therefore, you cannot abuse it. I gave the example of the presidency. Let me give another example of, say, like a very powerful tool, a very sharp knife, right? I don't want to just give it to anybody and say, okay, now practice. Because by the time they perfect their technique, they might have chopped off a few fingers or a few limbs, or maybe even caused worse injury. So I will gradually give you that tool. So you have the powerful tool, but you're trained and you're disciplined and you're able to use it safely and effectively. Last thing I want to say, this is not just about Imam Mahdi. Even Tawheed. Tawheed is the foundation of Islam. Most important doctrine from which everything else emanates. Prophet, Quran, Revelation, Day of Judgment, Imam, everything comes from Tawheed. And yet the Quran, although it says, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, it says, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. The Quran talks about Tawheed, but many Muslims have controversies about Tawheed. The attributes of Allah, if you studied Islamic theology, you know, not just Shia and Sunni, even among Sunnis, there are different beliefs among Atharis, Salafis, the Ash'aris, Maturidis, Mu'tazilis are not considered Sunni today, but they were a very powerful group at one time. And within these groups, there are differences. The attributes of Allah, about free will and predestination. Okay, so if Tawheed is the essence of Islam, is the Quran explicit about Tawheed? It's explicit about there being one God, but it's not explicit enough to eliminate disputes among Muslims about every issue of Tawheed. Can I say God is up there? Some Muslims say that you are misguided or even an unbeliever if you don't believe God is up there. And other Muslims say that you are misguided or unbeliever if you do say God is up there. So the Quran is clear. You're right. But the point is that the Quran is clear in a certain way. That there is muhkam and mutashabih. Sure. Do you understand what I mean by the Quran is clear in a certain way? What I mean by the Quran is clear in a certain way is that the Quran is clear. Nothing is like God. But what does nothing like God mean? We, as Shia, believe nothing is like God means that no, you cannot say God is up there. Because then you are implying that objects that have space or time are like God. But other Muslims say that no, we have a hadith. The Prophet, na'udhu billah, is reported to have said that Allah sits on his throne and his body is bigger than the throne and it hangs over like a overweight person, a little bit, na'udhu billah. And so they have these, and they accept those ahadith. They don't realize it's contrary to the Quran. Do you see my point? So go ahead, ask your question.
Like taking it more broadly, wouldn't you agree that the Quran is a lot more explicit or a lot more clear about the things that are in the category of beliefs, aqaid, that we have to believe in, that Allah will judge us on the Day of Judgment, right? It's a lot more explicit and clear about those requirements, criteria. When we're talking about the Prophet, it said, the Prophet, Muhammad is the Prophet. He's the final Prophet. With Day of Judgment, so many verses, very clear. With Tawheed, yes, there are disputes about particulars, but
so what you're saying. Yeah, so the question is, isn't the Quran clear about the beliefs that we are going to be asked about by Allah? Yes. So what I'm saying is, you're exactly right. The Quran is clear, but it's not clear in a way that makes everything explicit and that results in there not being disputes. So when people come and say, well, how come some of these Shia beliefs, they require contemplation, they require explanation, they require other verses to fill in the picture or a hadith of the Prophet to fill in the picture, then I'm going to reject it. That my point is this. There is a certain way of approaching the Quran which looks at the Quran as kind of a book of information. And when you are reading Wikipedia, when you're reading a textbook or an encyclopedia, the goal is to make as much information as accessible as possible. It's never, let's make this a little bit difficult. Because it's not testing you. It's not training you to wield that tool effectively. It's just giving you the explanation. That's the wrong approach to the Quran. The Quran is not giving you information for everything to be as explicit as possible. The Quran is training you to be a mu'min. Sometimes that means, as you're saying, give you the information, the foundation very clearly. Right? Otherwise, how are you going to know where to start? But then once you're in that process, some things the Quran makes a little bit more difficult for you to understand. Why? So you spend time with the book. Or so you go and you refer to the Prophet. Best example of that is not actually in doctrine, it's in law. But doctrine is also an example. So Tawheed, these are very fundamental questions. I, as a human being, do I have free will or not? Right? Is my intellect independently able to understand good and bad, or not? If God were to punish a prophet, na'udhu billah, would that be just? Is that possible or not? These are not small questions. Because the Quran says Allah is not unjust. And these are major theological questions, and Muslims quoting the Quran have disagreed.
But it's fair to say that Allah gives you enough information to be a Muslim, but then you have to go out and strive to become a mu'min?
Exactly. Allah gives you enough information to get started on the journey. But then to go on that journey, you need to think about the Quran. And if Allah had just made it obvious, if Allah had said, all right, Imam Ali is the first Imam, Imam Mahdi is the second Imam, it's going to take 1400 years and who knows how long more, hopefully not much longer. But then, we would have been, okay, this is great. But what about all of those people in the meantime who would have either been misled or would have said that I can take it easy because it's not going to happen for a long time? The Quran already says that the last Imam is going to have a long life. So I don't need to worry about it. So do you see, the Quran is not just for us. People today say, how come the Quran doesn't say more clearly that the earth revolves around the sun? That would make it easier for you to accept it's a miracle. But it would have been a reason that somebody 200 years ago might disbelieve. Because in their village, they don't know that. So the Quran wants to guide you and me, but it also wants to guide that person who doesn't know this. The best example is Salah. I know this is not theology, but it's an example. The Quran gives you a detail on how to do wudu. And it gives you no detail on how to do prayer. It seems backwards. Wudu is a muqaddama, a preliminary for prayer. Wudu is in detail. And if you can't do wudu, then tayammum. So that's all in the Quran explicitly. But prayer, when? Only in general. How? Only in general. There's sujood, there's ruku. Right? So what is the Quran doing? It's telling you, if you want to pray, you have to go to the Prophet. It's pushing you to the Prophet. Same thing with theology. Tawheed, yes, there's one God. But if you want to truly understand Tawheed, you have to go to the Prophet. You have to go to Nahj al-Balagha. You have to go to Ahlul Bayt. If you don't go to Ahlul Bayt and you just stay with the Quran, you're going to have those same disputes that every book of Muslim doctrine has. And the majority of Muslims, their Tawheed is deficient. Why? Not because they don't read the Quran, not because they're insincere in trying to understand the Quran, but because the Quran gave you the foundation of Tawheed. And then how do those verses fit together? It's not a puzzle. It's not meant to misguide you. It's not a puzzle, because a puzzle is also one-dimensional. It's deep. And the depth you can really only access through sincerity of intention and through Ahlul Bayt. So, to conclude, when you look at the verses of Imam Mahdi, don't immediately say, well, how come it's not more obvious? The Quran is the last book. This is the book when that promise is going to take place. It wants to guide you to the infallible successors of the Prophet, and in particular, the last successor who's going to fulfill all of the promise that Allah made to humanity and to the prophets. but it wants to prevent it from being abused. And the way to do that is to give clear guidance, but to do so in a way that is not just superficial. It requires effort. So the process of accessing that guidance makes you worthy of that guidance.
There's a question in the chat as well.
There's a question in the chat. And just to give you an example, if you look at how many people tried to abuse the belief in the Mahdi, you will understand how important it is. The first Abbasid caliph, his name was Abdullah al-Mansur, actually after Safa, but the first main caliph was Abdullah al-Mansur. He named his son Muhammad Mahdi, and he gave him the title Mahdi. Why? Because he wanted him to be the Mahdi. So this is the kind of thing, and the same thing happened in other periods in history as well. So this is the beauty of the Quran. Good question. How do you approach the question of Tawheed or the Quran with people from other schools of thought? So that's why I made that introduction. It's a very common question, probably the most common question. It's not, tell me where in the Quran does Tawheed, or where in the Quran does Imamate, or where in the Quran does Ismat, or where in the Quran does Mahdawiyat come from? It's how come the verse is not more explicit? So what I would recommend is start by saying that, look, we all believe in Tawheed, but you agree that there are disagreements among Muslim historians about many of the important subjects of Tawheed, not some minor details. Does God have a place? That's an important question. Are God's attributes separate from his existence and his essence? That's an important question. Because some Muslims, they have some belief which in some ways is similar to the beliefs of some mushrikeen or the Trinity. Do we have free will or not? That's an important question. It's not a minor question about God and about God's justice and about punishment and reward. So start from there, and that gives the background for you to say that just like Tawheed is mentioned in the Quran, but you have to contemplate to get the details, and Muslims still have disagreements. I will tell you the ayat that talk about Imam Mahdi. But if it's in need of discussion, or if there are disputes, then don't say that the argument is invalid. The same thing is true about Tawheed itself. But in the end, one of those understandings of the Quran is right. Either we are right, based on Ahlul Bayt, that people have free will, or we are wrong. Right? Similarly, these verses of Imam Mahdi, they are in the Quran, and we are giving you an argument about why they refer to Imam Mahdi. The fact that other people have a different opinion does not mean the verse is unclear. It does not mean the argument is invalid. It's simply because that is the language that the Quran uses. And why does the Quran use that language? It uses that language because it is trying to mold your iman and your religiosity in a way to make you worthy of understanding the higher. It doesn't want to give you that sharp knife before you are disciplined enough to handle it. Because, yes, the belief in the Mahdi is a very sharp knife. Meaning, if you understand it well, then it can do great good. But if you understand it wrongly, it can do great evil. In fact, the Quran mentions this about the Jews, that in Medina they came, وَكَانُوا مِنْ قَبْلُ يَسْتَفْتِحُونَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. They believed in the Mahdi, in the promise, but they wanted to just have victory, became supremacist. That became the reason why they disbelieved in Prophet Muhammad, because they wanted to have supremacy. Prophet Muhammad was not from Bani Israel. فَلَمَّا جَاءَهُمْ مَا عَرَفُوا كَفَرُوا. They said, we're not going to take this. See what I mean by sharp knife? You have to understand correctly, with humility, and that requires not just getting the answer obvious, but getting the answer through effort, through contemplation, through purity, through work. But the Quran does give you the foundation for Tawheed, for our doctrine, and for our practice. So all of our foundational beliefs as Muslims and as Shia Muslims, they are rooted in the Quran. They are based in the Quran. It's just they are not always super obvious on the surface and superficial level of the Quran. It requires contemplation. So that took a little bit longer.
Thank you so much.
Inshallah.
Always you make the continuation of the session harder with your beautiful
Not at all.
explanation. Now, how can we continue, right? That's a big challenge.
Jazakallah,
Thank you
inshallah.
so
Thank
much.
you, inshallah. I will,
Inshallah.
with your permission,
Yes, okay, thank
step
you.
out, inshallah.
But inshallah, we'll benefit from you.
Inshallah.
More comment session. Okay, let's recite the salawat. Allah. Just 1 second. Technical difficulty. Oh, thank you. It's good. Is it from there? All right. Apologies for this technical difficulties. So I wanted to just add one other point, or just in addition to what Said mentioned very beautifully, and I think that was a very important opening remarks to us before we start talking about Quran. As was mentioned, Quran having mutashabih verses, we usually see it as a weakness, right? We wish that it was not like that. It was very obvious. However, Quran talks about it as a strength. In Surah Zumar, verse 23, Allah نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم إلى ذكر الله ذلك هدى الله. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Quran is the best statement that we sent down. But what is the title? What is the property? What is the adjective Allah uses for Quran? Kitaban mutashabihan. It is mutashabih because that's a miracle that will make Quran the eternal miracle of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for all people at all time. So with that, let's start talking about verses related to Imam Mahdi alayhi salam, and inshallah we will move forward. There are different ways to look at the verses of Quran related to Imam Mahdi and Mahdawiya. When we say Imam Mahdi, it also related to what we call it Mahdawiya, the general topic of the Savior. There are books written in that subjects, and they categorize verses of Quran, but depending on how you categorize and how you look at them, there are about between 300 to 500 verses of Quran related to this topic, which is beyond our imagination, basically, right? We were expecting maybe 3, 4, 10, maximum 20, right? But that's not the case. There are categories that they have the we can categorize the verses in Quran related to Imam Mahdi alayhi salam, which we'll talk about briefly today, and we start with the first one if we have time. So the concept of continuity of divine representatives of God on earth, that is the monumental belief of Shias. That's the core belief that other beliefs basically are driven from that. So that has been discussed in Quran, which if we understand it, it will imply and it will show that at all time there is a godly appointed person on earth. So the question that, do we have an imam? Do we have a divinely appointed person on earth now? We know him or we don't know him. The answer is yes, because we have something that we'll talk about mentioned in many verses of Quran, 20 plus verses in Quran. They talk about this concept. They elaborate and they shed light from different angles on this topic, that at all time God has not left mankind alone. There is a representative on earth that provides guidance and is the refuge for people. The second topic that is related, and there are verses in Quran about it, is the promise of God about the earth and what will happen to earth in terms of mankind and also before the day of judgment. And when we say earth, because as you know, in the يوم القيامة يوم تبدل الأرض غير الأرض, the earth will be something else. So when Quran is talking about the earth, it is talking about events or things that will happen before يوم القيامة, which we'll inshallah see some of the verses that they talk about it. The other category of verses in Quran is the one that they talk about the triumph of the religion of God, because that is something that has not happened yet. There is no one dominant religion on earth that everyone will worship God only, and nothing but God will be worshipped, as Quran says in some of the promises that we'll see and we will read. What is the implication? What is it talking about? These verses are talking about the day that the religion of God will be established on earth. And as we'll see them, the question is, how is that possible? This is something we can ask other Islamic schools, that if you believe that there is a disconnect after Prophet, and we see the basically on the ground how many different sects we have in Islam, which one will be the one that God has chosen? And how can we be assured and be certain that this is the one? Because you believe that there is no divinely appointed person on earth anymore. So how can that promise will happen and be established on earth? There are verses that they talk about, or they give examples about the occultation or the concept of ghiba of the Imam, occultation, and the examples from other prophets, and also the details in terms of how is that possible and what is the concept. In that regard, there are verses that they talk about some people that when we look deeper, we see that companions of Imam Mahdi, or the companions of the Savior, or the people that they will be with that Savior, an inheritance of the earth, they have been described in Quran. And two last categories, which is very interesting. One is the return of Jesus alayhi salam, because Quran talks a lot about Jesus, Masih. But when it talks about, in some verses, that all Christians will believe in him, things like that, we'll inshallah talk about, and that's another thing, that when that's going to happen, and if that's the ayah or that's the concept that we are expecting, how that relates to Imam Mahdi alayhi salam. And lastly, and again, there are different ways that you can categorize, and scholars, they have categorized differently, but this is just something I thought might be beneficial for our sessions, and we'll follow that. And the last one is Raj'at. Raj'at, as you may know, is the belief that Raj'at in literal meaning means return. Okay, the return of groups of people, both from believers and non-believers, to the earth after their death, before day of judgment, if I say it in a very short descriptive way. Return of certain groups of people, both from believers and non-believers, on earth before the day of judgment. And that's one of another unique beliefs of Shia that is rooted in Quran. There are very interesting verses in Quran that they talk about it. Okay, so before we start with the first group of verses of Quran, any question, any comment? We try to finish on time at 11, inshallah. So let's continue. We're gonna read the verses of Quran and then briefly discuss about them, and then some of them we may go deeper and have more discussions. This is the way, inshallah, we'll be doing it. All right. So the first category, the continuity of the divine representative on earth. We talked about how important that belief is, and that's the monumental belief of Shia. And that is what differentiates us from other schools and also other religions. We have a lot of narrations in our book of Hadith talking about this concept, that the Hujjah of God has been on earth before mankind, with mankind, and will be the last person on earth. And the earth has never been empty of such person. So, but those are in narrations of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. In Quran, we want to see the ayat and discuss them. So there are, as I said, 20 plus verses regarding that. For this discussion, I've selected like about 12. We'll inshallah talk about them. And some of them you will see that they have been repeated. And Mathaniya, the ayah that we read from Surah Zumar, it's like reiteration. Quran talks about concepts from different angles in different places, and that has a value. So I tried to not cut like those. Let's see, in this course we want to do that, right? Maybe in lectures and others we just mention one and move on. But we want to see the numbers. I think that would be important. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إنما أنت منذر ولكل قوم هاد. O Prophet, you are only a warner, and there is a guide for every people, for every nation. ولكل قوم هاد. هادي. إنا أرسلناك بالحق بشيرا ونذيرا وإن من أمة إلا خلا فيها نذير. Again, pay attention to the fact that Quran elaborates on this concept from different perspectives, right? That, O Prophet, we have sent you as a bearer of good news, as a warner, and as a warner. And the concept, the main thing is, I mean, you being a Bashir wa Nadhir is based on our will, which is there is no group وَإِن مِّنْ أُمَّةٍ إِلَّا خَلَا فِيهَا نَذِيرٌ. There has been always warners in any group. وَلِكُلِّ قَوْمٍ هَادٍ. Each group of people, God says, we have assigned a guide for them. The next ayah, وَلَقَدْ وَصَّلْنَا لَهُمُ الْقَوْلَ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَذَكَّرُونَ. So, wasalna means, what is it? It implies the continuity of it, right? We have at least 4 friends that they are Arab speaking, and we have a lot online as well, you can confirm the implication. Wasalna implies that continuity, that tawsil. It's always there. Let me say something in line with what Sayyid Suleiman was explaining earlier. It's ironic, it's funny that a lot of concepts are right in front of us in Quran, but we don't see. When Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, they remind us about them, we say, oh, yeah, why I didn't pay attention to. In the discussion that was, we had earlier, that Quran talks about foundations, and then we go to Imams and Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam and Prophet for explanations. Remember, the explanations of Ahlul Bayt also are not separate from Quran. In many cases, which is a very interesting thing that we see in narrations, they refer back to Quran when they want to elaborate on another Quranic verse. And that's a very interesting thing. And a lot of times they refer to something that, don't you see that? Haven't you read that ayah? This ayah is clearly saying that, but I didn't pay attention to. Like, for example, wasalna. The term wasalna in Arabic is very clear, talking about that concept of continuity, but we may not pay attention to. Or even some of the hadith is very interesting. Imam asked someone, aren't you an Arab? Aren't you Arab? I mean, how come you don't understand that the term istinsakh, for example, is writing from something that already exists in another context? But my point was, Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, in many cases, when they were explaining verses of Quran, they use other verses. They refer people, but give them a hint, give them a golden key, as I say. So go, and now you can see it also from Quran. لعلهم يتذكرون. We have certainly carried on this discourse. We have continuously sent our message down to people. They may take reminders, they may take admonition, right? The other verse, and by the way, this is a crash course, so we go fast. Each of these you can think and read more about them, how they're related to the concept of Imam Mahdi. Again, we are talking about, on the first category, the continuity of divine representative on earth, which means at all time there is a godly appointed person, which means right now there should be, according to Quran, a person that fulfilled that mission. يوم ندعو كل أناس بإمامهم. Surah Isra, verse 71. The day we shall summon every group of people along with their Imam. What does that mean? Every group of people will be summoned with their Imam. So that means there should be an Imam for each group of people. Otherwise, that summon, that call doesn't make sense. So if we at any time, kulla unasin, like all people at all time, the day of judgment, they will be called by their imams. Again, to the point that we had earlier, that was a very important intro that Said provided. Quran intentionally made it vague because it has a lot of layers. That imam, and if we pay attention to that, it solves some of our challenges, because in some of the hadith we see that, oh, imam, it's referring to the evil leaders, right? That, oh, pay attention to whom you are picking as the imam, because in the day of judgment you will be resurrected by that, and wherever that imam goes, you follow him. Okay, but now we are saying this ayah shows that at all time there is an imam. So there are different layers and different meanings. That yes, in one layer, Quran is talking about the righteous imam, the appointed by God imam, that will be the scale, the qualifier for everyone. Everyone after the imamah of Imam Mahdi alayhi salam on the day of judgment, we will be scaled, and he will be the qualifier, he will be the measure that, okay, He was the Imam. How did you do? In another angle, another layer, Imam alayhi salam will be the guide, and whoever took him as the Imam will follow him. And whoever took other people as the Imam, they follow him, that they will be resurrected with. Does that make sense? So the Imamihim can be the Imam that they took, can be the Imam that God assigned for them. And they either took him as Imam or no, they rejected and they followed others. Okay, so we can pause here because I wanted to be punctual. We start on time and we finish on time, inshallah. There are other verses in this topic that we will talk about, inshallah, next week. I wanted to thank everyone for your attendance. Inshallah, next week, we will be at Imam Ali Center. And then after 2 sessions, we come back in this location for those that they will be coming in person, inshallah. Okay, any question, any comments, any feedback before we recite dua and adjourn? Friends online? Check chat quickly. All right. So let's recite the dua and inshallah we close our session. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا اللهم اجعلنا من أنصاره وأعوانه اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد